live, Gary. All right, so let some people just jump in for it. It won't take a second, and I'll just knock this countdown off. All right, Mr. Wayne, here we go. All right, my friends. My name is Bishop Holsonback. This is my YouTube channel and my Facebook group, and I want to welcome you all to the show. Tonight we have Gary Wayne, and we're going to be talking about the Nephilim Wars. Gary's going to break down more about the Nephilim Wars to us in a minute. I wanted to talk about Gary Wayne's book and some other stuff. You know, my friends, what Gary Wayne's book did for me is connect the dots into Nephilim culture. Gary Wayne's book is a go-to book. It's like an encyclopedia. But my friends, it's broken down into small chapters where a person can digest the book. So please, my friends, go out and get Gary Wayne's book. And if you want a signed copy, all you have to do is go to Genesis6conspiracy.com. And Gary Wayne will give you a signed copy. Also, Gary's going to talk about the difference between getting this book on Amazon and getting a signed copy. Gary's going to break that down for us as well in a minute. You know, my friends, Nephilim culture and the wars is serious business, and Gary's going to connect the dots for us. So please stay tuned in. All right, Mr. Wayne, Nephilim wars. Would you like? I'm sorry. Let's start off about your book and how people can get your book, and where should they go get your book at?
Sure. So the best way to get a hold of my book is through my website. That's the Genesis6conspiracy.com, Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com. And also, it's also the best way to get a hold of me. So if you go over to the media page where it says, and it'll be a highlighted small sentence or part of a sentence that says to contact Gary Wayne for an interview, just click on there. And that's my email. And if you want to ask me for some information or ask me a question or anything you want to comment, you can. That'll be a direct email to me when you go through and send me the message. And so it might take me a month to get back to you, but I will get back to you on that. On the website as well, there's several different pages. And if you wanted to buy a copy of my book and get it signed, you just go to the Buy Now page and select Buy from the author. And on that page, you'll have options for the U.S. if you live in America, or Canada if you live in Canada, and anywhere else in the world. You go to the overseas page, and everybody can buy a book depending on where you're located, and I'll send a signed copy out to you. If you wanted to buy the book from Amazon.com or Amazon.ca or BarnesandNoble.com, there are links on the Buy Now page to all of those sites. And you can also link over to the Kindle version and get the digital copy if you want that. And I encourage people also have the digital copy if they can, because it just allows you to search and find things a little more quickly because there's so much information in the book. So the price that I sell it for, and Bishop and I were talking about this just before the show, is different than what you're going to find at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is I have a publishing agreement for the books that I retail or I sell. I cannot undercut the agreed on retail price, which is in the US $29.99, and then plus shipping. So I live in Canada as well, so I have to bring the book all the way from the US to Canada, which isn't the big cost because I bring it in some volume. But when I ship a book out individually back across the border, just as if you try and ship something to Canada or to, let's say, Britain or wherever, as soon as it goes across the border, the price goes from $4 or $5 in the US to like almost $20. At least that's the price I pay shipping it back to the US. And I know when I was in the US and I sold some books and I had to ship them back to Canada, it was about the same price. I thought, boy, it's cheap to mail in the US, but it's not cheap to mail to Canada from the US. But their prices in the US within the country are way less than Canadian prices, let me tell you. So I have that sort of $20 up cost plus the packaging of the book, plus the freight, plus what I paid for the book, and then whatever's left over, which isn't usually very much, but I do well enough on it so that it's worthwhile for me to do, and a little bit more than if you buy it from Amazon.com. But I get a royalty from the retailers through the publisher as well on it. And with Amazon, they have the market skewed so that they have the ability to flex with the pricing like no other company out there. So typically with the publishers and distributors, they get a 50% discount off of the retail price. And then out of that has to be enough room for the royalty for the author, myself, for the publisher, and for the distributor of the book. So they take a big chunk and nobody else gets that size of discount. Most of the other larger books retailers might get 35%, maybe 40, depending on, maybe Barnes and Noble might be a touch higher. But so Amazon has a significant discount over everybody else, and that, but you're sort of stuck between what you can sell it for based on the publishing price that's left for hopefully, because you have to have the publishing companies making some money, otherwise they go out of business. And the publishing industry in the last 20 years has absolutely been decimated. So it's important that continues. So that's why there's a difference in cost.
All right. Well, yeah, because I just had people ask me that, and Gary, I'm so thankful that you answered their question. All right, Mr. Wayne, I want to ask you a couple questions about Tubal-cain before we get into the Nephilim more. Where does he fit in? Does Tubal-cain fit into the Freemasons at all?
Well, he's one of their greater patriarchs. So Enoch, son of Cain, would be the greatest patriarch of ancient Masonry and who they recognize even to this day, because he's the one who takes the knowledge and separates it into the 7 sacred sciences, which then he created Enochian mysticism, the sun worship, to contain that knowledge, and then developed the mystery schools to develop those disciplines. And through the mystery schools started the secret societies, just as you have beta houses, alpha houses, skull of bones, all sorts of those organizations still attached to the universities today. So other major patriarchs are Jubal and Jubal. They're sons of Lamech, who's also a major patriarch, and Tubal-cain is also one of those sons. And Tubal-cain is probably a greater patriarch within Masonry than Lamech of the Cain line, and but lesser than Enoch. So Lamech, in his generation, starts a renaissance of Enochian mysticism, Enochian knowledge, and a sort of doubling down of advancing the knowledge. And that's also the generation where that knowledge merges with the fallen angels, as the book of Enoch talks about. And mythology, legends, and history all around the world have a similar accounting of the gods providing significant knowledge to humankind that starts civilization. So you have that generation, we have that renaissance, and within that renaissance rises Tubal-cain as probably the greatest leader and king of that time, and as a major artificer of metals and of a major alchemist. And so he has many sort of separating and distinguishing attributes that distinguish him from the other patriarchs, other than Enoch, who is considered the founder to secret societies and the Gnostic knowledge of cult religion. And Tubal-cain is as a spectacular warrior as well. So he's right up there in terms of being like the Nephilim. And in the Masonic tradition, the Cain line after Enoch, they're basically part of a Nephilim line. that there's an intermarriage. And even if that didn't happen at the time of Enoch, it happened by the time of Noah's birth and Lamech's generation of the Cain line. And then it's thought then that Tubal-cain probably has a mother that would be a giant. And also within that Gnostic occult religion, he is the one who is sometimes thought to have survived the flood, or one of those giants who would have survived the flood. So when you get a movie about Noah and you see the Gnostic overtones and things put in it, and in particularly the last movie I'm talking about, and you had a stowaway on the ark, just as Og in some polytheist legends are said to have stowed away on the ark. Well, that's Tubal-cain in that movie. That's projecting their belief in history onto the biblical story, because we don't get a stowaway mentioned anywhere biblically. We don't get a stowaway in the book of Enoch. We don't get a stowaway in some of the other apocrypha. So this is a polytheist addition, or in part of their belief system in terms of how they have giants survive the flood. So if in their belief system, then he survives the flood, then he becomes a significant patriarch to giants on the other side of the flood, understanding that he's a giant, right? And other Gnostic legends will also say, well, Tubal-cain was one of the sons of Noah on the ark.
Oh, yeah.
And then some other legends will say that all 3 sons were giants. And then some other legends will say all 8 were giants. So from the polytheist side, they get their additions on in so many different ways. So it's not always consistent, but the consistent factor is Tubal-cain. And Tubal-cain is one of the greater kings within the Sumerian king list. And I talk about him in the latter part of my book. So he's an important individual to the Masons and the Gnostics. And then a lot of people will connect the Kenizzites and the Cainites back to Cain, because Cainite is derived from the word Cain. I cover off in the new book that I think that that's not the lineage of Cain, but that is part of the recreation of the giants after the flood, and I provide the patriarch for that.
I had a comment in the comment box the other day, and anyways, Gary, I had said most likely the book of Enoch came over on the with Noah. Do you think so? Maybe.
Well, no? we're not really told how Enoch sort of comes about, right? But what we do know is there was many scrolls in the ancient 70 scroll hagiography of Jerusalem in the Old Testament. Many of them were lost, and so a lot of people think that the book of Enoch comes from pieces of some of those older scrolls, like the Toledoth of Noah, and there's a few other ones like that. But what we do get is we get a verse in the book of Jude that is almost a word for word quote that's referencing Enoch, that's in the book of Enoch, that sort of substantiates that there would have been writings of Enoch as a prophet, because he's called a prophet in the book of Jude. So that means a prophet has writings, just as all the prophets. Now, we're not sure where the Enoch tradition comes from after the flood, because we don't get the Torah until the time of Moses, in the time of the Exodus. And at that time, he's provided that Torah. And it seems odd that some of that dictation that he would have received as he received the book of Genesis might have been lost, but perhaps it was. But what we do know about the book of Enoch, even though we don't have a complete Hebrew manuscript, there are pieces of that manuscript indicating that it was a Hebrew manuscript. And we get words that show up in the book of Enoch and phrases that show up in the book of Enoch, and an alignment, except for some peculiar passages which may have happened with some corruption over the millennia as it was translated from Hebrew into Greek, into Aramaic, and into Ge'ez, and all the different versions, that there may have been a few corruptions in there. But you get, that term like the sons of God being angels. You get the watchers, just as we get Daniel 4 has the watchers written down. You get angels like the cherubim and the seraphim and the archangels, just as they're mentioned in the Bible. And one interesting group called the Ophanim, which are the wheel angels that are talked about in Ezekiel 1, 3, and 10, which aren't listed biblically or taught as one of those cherubim-like angels. And we know they're cherubim-like because they're distinct, because they actually have one face of a cherub, as the book of Ezekiel calls them. And the wheels that these wheel angels are in translates back to the Hebrew word Gilgal, as in Raphaim Gilgal, or Gilgal Raphaim, the wheel of the giants. But the word used for the beings or the angels within the wheels is Ophan. And you put the I am male plural on that, and that's the Ophanim that is talked about as the watchers in around the throne, and being like the throne angels in the book of Enoch. So we get that connection through so many of those types of things to say, hey, there was an original original Hebrew manuscript. Whether or not it's 100% accurate, we can't really verify it, and that's why it's Apocrypha. And there are some corruptions in there, and I have a document. If people want it, I'll take you through some of the corruptions. They're not major, but I think they've been altered by the Gnostics just to get their fingerprints on it.
Amen. I told the lady in the comment box, I said, I got things of my grandfather's, and most likely Noah had things of his grandfather's as well.
Well, yeah, there's no reason why Noah could not have taken some of those old documents with him, and there's no reason why that couldn't have been kept to a certain degree. I mean, they wouldn't have wanted to give too much knowledge about the antediluvian epoch because they didn't want it to restart. That wasn't the point. The point was a restart. But we don't get biblically that statement where you get that chain that Noah took some original things with him or wrote things down later, because who knows, the book of Enoch may have been penned by Noah after the flood, because he lived 350 years after the flood, but we don't get that specifically stated. So we want to make sure we don't get out too far over our skis in terms of what we can actually state.
Yeah, I think it's Jasher or Jubilees state something about garments that came over, or I could be wrong though.
Well, no, it that is in the book of Jubilee, in the book of Yasher. Again, that one is a very questionable one, and I have a great document as to why you want to really be careful. And I don't quote them in my first book or the second book. I just go right to the Jewish legends where a lot of that writing comes out of. But in that thought, and it's not that it's not wrong. We don't know this way or that way. What we do know is that biblically, when Eve and Adam were ostracized from Eden, they were naked, but upon the ostracization, God provided them clothes. So in the tradition of that as being preternatural clothing, even though they're made from the garments of animals, the thought in the book of Yasher is that this provided Adam great strength. Okay. Right? And sort of like the idea that Cain had a mark to protect him from some people. So, and that these garments that provided great strength for Adam were passed on down through his lineage, and then to Noah, and then on to the ark, and then passed down in that line of thought that the book of Yasher talks about on to Nimrod, as the reason for how Nimrod becomes so strong. So, but again, we don't have anything biblically to make those connections. We have Adam, we have the clothes, we have Noah, we have the ark, and we have Nimrod, who somehow becomes a Gibberim, a mighty one, but we don't get that smoking gun set of verses that'll connect those dots.
Well, we're going to connect the dots tonight into the Nephilim Wars, and I know Gary Wayne can do it because Gary's does it out of our Holy Bible. And so tonight, my friends, we're going to be talking about Nephilim Wars, but Gary's going to give we're going to do several series about the Nephilim Wars because there's just no way Gary can just come out and just give you everything tonight in an hour show. So Gary's going to do his best to break things down to you about the Nephilim Wars, and that way y'all get a good understanding, my friends. And Gary, I don't know if he has a great chapter on this in his book, so you can cheat a little and read Gary's book on you see. All right, Mr. Wayne, please break down the Nephilim Wars for us.
I will. Yeah. And believe me, there's way too much information to cover in a show. So I'm going to give kind of a summary today, and then maybe in shows down the road, we can maybe take a campaign or two. But I want to begin first with the idea of the wars before the flood. And again, biblically, we don't get that. We just get told there's violence, and the violence happens after the creation of the giants. But in polytheist history, the giants warred with each other, with humankind, with the gods. It was perpetual war. So that's sort of the MO, and that's the violence that totally overcomes the antediluvian world. And an interesting book, again, not biblical, but it gives you at least the flavor of that kind of things that were going on. I would suggest the Lost Book of King Og. Interesting read, not scriptural, but it gives you the level of the violence and how many kinds and different types of giants that there might have been. And that's based on a translation out of the Vatican from the Manichaean Book of Giants, which is a sort of a conversion or an amalgamation of the Persian version with the Aramaic Book of Giants. Right, so it's and so that's why it's a little bit different. But so the Book of King Og is part of that Manichaean Book of Giants. So, anyways, so after the flood, you get that same sort of tradition that these giants that show up after the flood, and I think it's a second incursion for the most part, although I'm open to survival as well, they have the same MO. They're going to be a warring nation as well. And not very long after the dispersion of Babel, at about 100 years after the flood, we get told of the wars of the giants, the giant wars in Genesis 14. And so you have a group of giant kings coming out of Mesopotamia, which is a distinct group that is in the Middle East area, or not the Middle East, but the Covenant Land area. And believe me, I cover this off in many chapters and details in the new book. I give you a bit of a summary in the first book, but I spend a fair bit of time on this. And it's a war again. It's kind of like the Nephilim world order after the flood, but there's rivals. And so this is going to be the major war that happens in the time of Abraham, just after Abraham goes to the land of the covenant from Ur. And so that's the first war. And you get giants in the covenant land like the Emim and the Horim and the Amalekim and the Rephaim that are mentioned in that war. And this is the war that is just before Abraham receiving the blessing in Genesis 15. And he's given the list of the nations that are in the covenant land. That includes the Rephaim as the giants, and that goes back to Hebrew Rapha for giant. So some translations might say giant, but typically in the King James, you get Rephaim that shows up in Genesis 14 and Genesis 15. The other 23 times where Rapha shows up in Hebrew, it's translated as giant in the King James Version book. So this is the first war, and it happens in the time of Abraham. But in the time of the Exodus, we see a specific war where you have Israel that is going to be going up with these descendants of those giants that were warring in the War of Giants in Genesis 14. And it's essential context for understanding what happens in the conquest, that they're just not going against defensive lands, because the Rephaim, the Emim, the Horim, the Zamzuzim, the Zuzim, the Avim, the Amalekim, and on and on and on. These are all Aboriginal people before the people of Canaan go to the covenant land after Babel. So they're created shortly after the flood, likely from Canaanites, which I cover off in the second book as to who those nameless 9 patriarchs are for 9 of the tribes of Canaan. You've got 12, 3 are named Heth, Sidon as the sons of Canaan. The other 9, like the Amorites, are not listed. So the Amorites are like a blonde hair, blue-eyed mini giant. They're bigger than humans, but they're smaller than the Rephaim, and they're thought procreated by the Anakim through intermarrying with the Canaanites.
They had blonde hair.
Yeah, the Anakim had blonde hair and blue eyes as well. Yes.
Yeah. How we know?
How do we know? There's writings and relief inscriptions that show that. So, and again, I'll cite those in the book. I cite some of those details in the first book. So when Israel leaves leaves Egypt, they're going to be attacked by the Amalekites. They're not necessarily the Amalekim. The Amalekites in this case are the offspring of Timnah, a daughter of Seir, who is a Horim giant, and she marries Eliphaz, who's the son of Esau, brother of Jacob. So you have this hybrid race of Amalekites that they're going to be warring against. I think the Amalekites are going to be bolstered by Amalekim from the Petra area, where the Amalekites had their capital and the Amalekim had their capital. But there's still a large amount of hybrids as well. But this is the group that is going to attack Israel at Rephidim, and I call it the Battle of Rephidim in the book. And it's a location in the desert just after they've come out of Egypt, and they are a ragtag nation of slaves, not been trained in war, not been trained in discipline, not fully monotheist, just happily to be led by Moses away from slavery. And they're going to go up against this very powerful nation, one of the greatest nations of war at that time, of hybrid giants and giants. And Israel doesn't have a chance. And so in this battle, God steps in, and with Moses and the arms being held up, and it's a part of the first test of faith. And that's why the Amalekites are held in such low esteem for the cowardly attack, but they were wanting to get the birthright. So that's the first battle. And the second battle happens 40 years later, after the 40 years of forging their faith in the desert. And where they go is they go back to the way of the spies, the way of the scouts. So 40 years previous, Moses sent the scouts into the covenant land, and they brought back the report about the Anakim giants and the people that are larger than the Israelites, the Amalekites, the Canaanites, and the Jebusites, and the other nations that were listed there. But all but 2 of the spies, all but Caleb and Joshua, they are so afraid of the giants and the hybrid giants that they say, we saw Anakim there who are the descendants of giants. I won't go through the delineation on that, but they're like grasshoppers before them. It's embellished, but it doesn't mean that they weren't up against giants. They just weren't quite the size that they had said, as talking about the Nephilim before the flood. So this is where they return after the 40 years to Athronim. And the king of Arad, who's a Rephaim king, and I talk about him in detail in my book, leads his army out from southern Canaan, from the Hebron area. So probably were associated with those Anakim kings of Telmai, Ahiman, and Sheshai at Hebron, Kiriath Arba, which is named after the city of Arba. Arba is the patriarch of the Anakim, whose name isn't listed in the table of nations, by the way, because no Rephaim are listed in the table of nations. And so Israel is really enthused, but they don't listen. And so they do an attack without God's authority to do it when and how he told them to do it, and they get their butts whooped. And then they repent, and it's part of the forging of faith process, and then God delivers them into his hands in that war. And from there, they don't go right up into the covenant land. And they don't go through the Philistines. They actually go back south around the sea, around the Edomites, around the Edomites that expelled the giants, from the Edomites that didn't expel the giants, as Deuteronomy 2 talks about, around Ammon and Moab. And they were told not to provoke them because they're the descendants of Abraham, right? And they've already received part of that larger inheritance that we talked about earlier. So they're going to march up the east side of the Jordan River and right into the land of Bashan, right into the land of Mount Hermon. And I call this the Eastern Campaign. And so they're going to take on King Sihon and his 35 to 40 cities. He's got 7 or 8 pentapolis city-states, plus all of the villages and all of the Amorites that he's king over, because most of the Rephaim were driven out in the War of Giants. And Israel defeats them rather easily with God's help. And then King Og steps in, reigning from Edrei and Ashtaroth, and takes his army, which is even larger. He's got 60 cities. He has the greatest empire of that time. And he's the last of the Rephaim, the last of the giants. So probably the last of the second creation of the original Rephaim giants after the flood. And he rushes into his support. That is either one of his best friends or his brother, depending on which source you're reading on that. And he gets whipped as well. And again, all the details, I'll go through the whole process in the battles, just give you sort of the highlights. And then they also take on the pentapolis of the Midianites, who are also descended from Abraham as well, through Keturah, the consort of Abraham. And they would like to see Israel wiped from the face of the earth as well for inheritance rights. And so those 5 kings are beaten by Moses, and then Moses, he dies before they can cross over the Jordan. So that's the Eastern Campaign. So you have these major battles going on even before they get into the covenant land. So when they cross into the covenant land, and they take down Jericho for the start, for a sign of what's going to happen, and as a warning to all the peoples, hybrid giant alike, that are living throughout the land, that this is going to be your destiny if you choose to stay. But you can leave, or you can fight. And so this begins what I call the Central Campaign. So they're going to march through the complete central area that's in around the area where Jericho is. They're going to take they're going to partner with Gibeon, but cities of Ai, cities like that. And they're also going to dip in and do raids into the south, into Hebron again. And they're going to attack Sheshai, Talmai, and Ahiman, and drive them out temporarily. And then after that campaign, and it's an incredible amount of cities and armies that they'll have defeated, they're going to march up. After they march back to Gilgal, their base camp, they're going to march up quickly through the mountain sort of spine, the road between the mountains, and do it before the kings of the north realize what happened. Because what's going on in the Central Campaign is they're starting to unite in great alliances because of the sudden fast victories that Israel is having. And all of those kings of the central, of the south, and the north are now becoming a big alliance, but the northern kings haven't fully brought their forces back together. And so Joshua is going to rush up and get to them before they expect it. So he's going to meet them in the north. And this is a massive alliance. And King Jabin, who is, another one of those great patriarchally named dynastic kings. And there's a King Jabin, for example, that shows up in the book of Judges after Joshua's lifetime. there's going to be another war against. So this name is handed down patronymically, just as Agag is, and many of or Hadad would be another one. It's like a pharaoh title, right? It's passed on. It may not be the actual name of the king, but it's a title. And so this is the greatest alliance ever seen in terms of numbers, in terms of chariotry, in terms of horses, iron weapons, the whole bit. And Joshua catches them off guard and wipes out the army and sends them fleeing, and he chases them back into their individual areas from the coast of Sidon back to the mountains of Bashan before going back to Gilgal at their base camp. But the war's not over yet. Then comes the mountain campaign. So where you had many of the giants escape as refugees from the south and from the central area and the northern area, they went into the mountains and held out. So now they're going to have to flush the balance out of the mountains. And this is the mountain and southern campaign. So they go into the mountains first, and particularly are taking on the Anakim at this point in time, and finish them off, and then go back again to take the Hebron area that was first taken in the central campaign. But they obviously, after the Israelite army left, the giants retake that back again. And by this time, Joshua is growing old and Israel is growing tired, but the wars aren't over. It's just that generation is looking for some rest, and they didn't even take on the Philistines at this point. So when you look at the various wars that are talked about through the time of the judges, these are all giant wars. And I cover that off in detail again in the second book by each of those campaigns, each of those battles. And that's when like Jabin shows up. And that's when Caleb goes back in early on into Hebron and chases the Anakim back out of Hebron and finally kills those 3 kingly giants. I mean, they're quite resistant, right? Resilient. Yeah. So it took a lot to push them out. And the wars continue into the time of the monarchy. And that King Saul is brought back in by the Holy Covenant and the Holy Covenant obligations written into the covenant in the war edict and the taking of the land edict, that they would have to drive out all of the giants. And so King Saul is bound into that covenant that he's supposed to look at every day and read to remind him of his obligations. And they begin with the Amalekites and King Agag. And there's a King Agag also in the time of the Exodus, as the book of Numbers talks about. So again, you have that patronymic name. And so he doesn't finish the job off, which is why he's going to lose his dynasty, and he's going to lose even after several wars against the Philistines. Are finally going to defeat him, and then David takes over, and he finishes off the rest of the giant nations. He finishes off the Amalekites. He finishes off the Philistines and the hybrid and giants, the Cherithim, the Pelathim, the Casualzim, and the Philistines, who are the hybrids that are part of that whole alliance. And that alliance included the Avim, who controlled one of the cities, and Anakim, who controlled 2 of the cities. I think there's also, you can make it a case that maybe Avim controlled even another major city within the Philistine alliance as well. And then David is also going to take on the Edomites, or the Horim, and that dynasty, both in the area in the south, and then that are classified as the Syrians in and around Mount Hermon. So there's 2 different sets of wars that are going on there that he's going to take over as well. So I cover all of those campaigns individually in the new book. So there's a lot more information. I know I covered a lot of territory and a lot of time, but it gives you an idea that if you're not told about who these people are,
that's right,
you don't have any idea what's going on from the time of the Exodus to the time of King Solomon.
I mean, and Gary, you connect the dots so well that I cannot wait to get my hands on your new book. I mean, because the first book, and it was enough to connect the dots, but just the way that you connect the dots and explain it, it's not all that thou and thee stuff. I don't know. It's just you do a very well job. we just got a comment from Robin Rodriguez. And Mr. Wayne, I want to tell you right now that Sister Robin, she thrives on your book. she's in every show that I do, and she's always quoting your book is what I'm saying, because I know your book, and she's always quoting from it. And she put, glad to be here and have Gary cap off my day, Bishop. Oh, you're welcome, Sister Rodriguez. You know, Gary, well, I keep hesitating because I don't want to lose this thought in my mind, and I just want to ask you real quick. Did King Og have a last name? Did he have a other than King Og? How do we know about King Og?
Well, we get that name that comes down to us, right, in the Bible, and it's thought to be the same king as Ug in the Ugaritic texts of the Rephaim as well. And again, it's thought to be more of a title than an actual name. So we may not have the actual name. Yeah, and that happens a lot in the Bible in terms of titles that are assigned. And Nimrod, for example, likely isn't his original name, but was assigned that name to represent, the rebellion that he did against God. So that's not an unusual thing. Just as in the first book I talk about, David probably wasn't his real name. That was a title, the Davidum, and that Elihan was likely his first real name, and that Saul was Labiah, or the Lion of God, before Saul was selected as meaning chosen, as the one chosen to be the first king.
That's probably to confuse us, the bottom line, right?
Yeah.
I just had to read this comment out loud, and it's coming from Gabriella Amtrust, and she's stating that our dynamics is the best she's ever seen on YouTube. Pretty much is what she's saying. Wonderful to see you guys and the author live. What a brilliant dynamic between you two. Yahweh bless you and all the best. Well, thank you, sister. Thank you for such a wonderful comment. Yeah, because Gary, I always wonder, and I always got to remember what you just said about the titles. And they're giving these titles, just like Satan, Lucifer, and they're giving all these different titles. Well, Mr. Wayne, we're coming up on an hour, and I told you, our show only lasts about an hour. We got about 15 more minutes. I can come up with some good questions in 15 more minutes. I know we've got 30 people tuned in right now.
There ought to be some good questions coming from the chat. That's for sure.
Yeah, we need some comments from the comment box. So please comment in the comment box. I don't know if y'all know, but we're live and we're interacting with Gary Wayne. My friends, you're in your home. I'm in my home. Gary's in his home, and we're interacting. We're fellowshipping right now. And this is the time to ask Mr. Wayne questions. This is why we're doing this broadcast is for you guys, because we all got different views, and that's what makes us different. All right, Mr. Wayne, I got some questions for you. We was talking about the reason why I wanted you to talk about Tubal-cain in the beginning of the show, because he plays such a big part in the pantheon. And Gary, do you think Mount Hermon is where they still worship the pantheon at? Because there's a UN base on top of that Mount Hermon. You think they go up there and have their little powwows and rituals and stuff like that up there?
Oh, I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
So I think that Mount Hermon is the home of the Baalim gods, and that was and I know a lot of those would have been sent to the abyss, but the ones who replaced them would still be reigning from Mount Hermon, just as the assembly of the Anunnaki was at Mount Nippur, or at Nippur, and that mountain is thought to be in Sumerian records to be Mount Hermon, just as the Epic of Gilgamesh at the Cedar Forest is at Mount Hermon. So this is a central mountain to many, many, many cultures, where you had this assembly of the gods. That's the assembly of the gods in Psalm 82. And they rule from that assembly over the 70 nations that are talked about in Deuteronomy 32. And so this assembly of the gods is also talked about in the Ugaritic texts as the assembly of Datan, and the Datanu, or the Tuatha De Danann, as they're known in other transliterations of the giants, and they're overseen by the council of the gods of Mount Hermon, that includes Baal and his other ruling gods. And it was ruled there by his father El before the flood. So this is that temple, this is that holy mountain of assembly. And when you look at Armageddon, Armageddon, that's Mount Megiddo, as a lot of people think. And Megiddo means assembly, except the problem with that plain is there's no mountain there. So it's right. So it's as you look into the history, and I cover this off in the detail as well, and I know Dr. Heiser covered some of this material off, but I'll connect it with more things than just the linguistic connections as I'm talking about with these other assemblies. But as you take that word assembly or congregation, which is in Isaiah 14 for the congregation that's talked about with God, and this is like a counterfeit congregation of Satan. That is the word Moad or Mogad, and it's that G that in around the time of Tiberius gets silenced, and it's replaced with what they call, I think it's an IN, like an apostrophe. And so it's now sort of understood as Moad instead of Mogad. So when you look at what's going on, that means assembly. And just as Mount Hermon is that mountain of assembly, this is where those armies are going to gather, and where Antichrist will march to wait for Jesus to come after coming up through Edom and Basra. And that's where that battle will take place, because that's the assembly of Satan's Psalms 82 Council of the Gods that Antichrist will answer to. So yeah, I think they have possession of Mount Hermon today, which is it's the largest manned UN operation in the world. And it is, and you don't get any real information as to why they have it or what they're doing there, other than the platitudes that it's a good strategic place, and 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 they sort of whitewash the whole sort of history. It's got the gateway to the gods there, the cave. You got the Pan Temple. You've got all these other different things that are going on at that mountain. So
up to Mount Hermon, you don't hear people summit, doing that summit at all.
Yeah.
Yes, Gary. Yeah. I got another question. Oh no, actually, we got a question from the audience. It says, "This coming from TJ Best. Please define Enlil. Nelil. Do you know what he's talking about?"
Can you run that by me again? What's his name?
His name is TJ Best, and it says, "Please define Enlil."
Oh, Enlil.
All right.
Oh, Enlil is a god in the Sumerian pantheon, or the Mesopotamian pantheon, and he's the brother of Enki.
All
and
right.
So he is a offspring god. He's one of the post-diluvian gods, so he might be equivalent to like Baal or Amot in the Canaanite pantheon, or to Zeus, for example. Enlil is thought in a lot of realms. Even some Christians talk about this in the same sort of aspect, which I think is just wrong, just on the premise, because of how the hierarchy works. But they classify Enlil as the god of the Bible, as opposed to just being another angel. And he's the brother of Enki. And so, for example, in the Sumerian legend history of Babylon at Eridu, there was a temple that was set up at the bottom of the ziggurat being built at the Tower of Babel, but in Eridu, in their version, to Enlil. So It's worshipped. He's a god that's worshipped in the pantheon. He's not because he's sort of the nemesis of Enki in polytheism. He's thought to be the god of the Bible, but this is an offspring god. So these are sons of Anu, a parent god. Parent god that Anu had, would be as a wife, as a consort, would be like Inanna, for example, the queen of heaven. And there was many parent gods. There's pairs of the parent gods in all of the pantheons. So Tiamat, which is a Leviathan type of comparison in terms of her descriptions, or Lotan or Yam, or all the different versions of this type of creature around the world. And as a mother goddess, was married to Absu. So if people are comparing the God of the Bible to a son of one of the parent gods,
Amen.
then what they're doing is they're degrading the God Most High, right? And so we ought to be careful with that. And we can't confuse antediluvian gods, which were the parent gods, which were sent to the abyss first, with offspring gods that take over after those parent gods are sent to the abyss. And they set up in their Saba, the host of heaven, in the assembly. They self-promote themselves to replace all the parent gods that disappeared. So if you look at in the Canaanite pantheon, we talked about El as being the parent god with Ashtaroth.
Right.
And then Baal is his son. And it's Baal who takes over after the flood. And Mot is his brother. Mot is the god of the underworld, as opposed to the description. Baal is kind of associated with the underworld too, but they have specific functions. And so you have to look at it in that sort of understanding. So in the Greek mythology, you have Kronos and Gaia as being the mother god and the parent god with Kronos, and their offspring, or Kronos' son, is Zeus, who takes over after the flood and creates giants like Hercules and Theseus and Perseus after the flood. So if you want to understand prehistory, you have to understand what happens before the flood, what happens after the flood, and who the gods were on both sides of the flood.
That's right. Enoch was Nimrod's cousin. Is that correct?
You're saying Enoch was Nimrod's cousin?
Is that correct? No or no?
No.
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 Okay. Would Tubal-cain, would he be related to Nimrod or Enoch in any way?
Only if Tubal-cain survived the flood would there be a connection to Nimrod, because Nimrod is born after the flood. He's the son of Cush, right? Just the same way you make the same argument for Enoch. Enoch was before the flood. So unless he survives the flood, whether it's Enoch son of Cain or Enoch son of Jared, the only way they could be related is if Enoch survives the flood and lives on earth after the flood.
You heard it here, my friends. Okay, Gabriella says, "Oh, and I would love to hear your opinion on whether the Tower of Babel is an allegory or when we lost telepathy because the words confuse." I'm probably confusing you, but can you read that here?
Yeah, I think I understand the question. So I do not think that Babel is an allegory. I think there's more to the story, but I don't think it's an allegory. So I think what happens is after the flood, you have giants that are being recreated, and probably with some of the stray Canaanites. They're around as the people are coming down the mountain, and they're very much afraid of them, and Nimrod is going to take over. And then Nimrod is going to become a tyrant, and he's going to impose his polytheist religion on the people forcibly. And he's like an antichrist type figure. But what he does is he starts to build this ziggurat, this pyramid type of structure, because ziggurats, pyramids, and towers were thought to be the same kind of structure. They may have a little bit different shape, but the same purposes. And so he's trying to build this pyramid that's going to reach heaven. Well, I don't believe that they were that dull, so to speak. There's no way they thought they could build a stone or a brick pyramid or tower that could reach up into heaven. It's just not physically capable and just not possible. But it was used allegorically, certainly that way for sure, and that he threatened in outside biblical legends to go into heaven and kill God if God got out of line again and would bring on another flood. That's the type of antichrist, brutish type of spirit that he had once he became corrupted, that he would speak. And so, but there's no way you could do that. I mean, you couldn't build it through the firmament. You couldn't build it up into another dimension. But again, as I mentioned, the Babel story is told not only in the Eridu recollection, it's also found in Aztec writings and Quiché Maya writings. It's also found in um, Akkadian writings and Armenian writings as well. And what's interesting in the Akkadian writings is that Babel was called Babalu, but it has a different meaning in Akkadian. And understand that after Babel, Nimrod stays in Shinar, which is Sumar, and he's going to be sort of the progenitor to many nations, including the Akkadians, right? And in Akkadian, the name Ilu, I-L-U, which is kind of like part of the name of Enlil that we talked about, the I-L, except it's got a U on it, is a transliteration of E-L for a god or an angel, or A-L as it's used in Baal for god or an angel, a fallen angel in that case, and I-L in Enlil. So A-L, E-L, I-L, I-L-U are different forms of the same root word, just transliterated in different languages. So that means a god or an angel in Babalu. And in Akkadian, Bab means gateway or a portal. And so this is either a gateway of the gods, like a Stargate is in the Stargate series, only this would go into a different dimension. And I'll come back to that in a second, or a portal into another dimension, because the only way you can go into heaven is enter in another dimension. And so Nimrod seems to have been either trying to create a technology with the knowledge he inherits, which is a sort of a long explanation, but he inherits the antediluvian knowledge according to the Gnostics and the Freemasons, and that he is creating a technology with this architecture as well, with the ziggurat. And so he's probably doing both. He's probably trying to get into Sheol or Hades, which is in another dimension in the earth, so occupying the same space, and trying to free the parent gods who were sent to the abyss before the flood for their crimes, and probably those offspring gods like Baal, and Anki, and Enlil, and Zeus that went to the abyss after the flood for creating, to bring back his pantheon of gods, right? And he, as I mentioned, is an archetypical antichrist figure. And so he is going to do what Satan tried to do. He is going to do what Satan tried to do by entering into heaven and overthrowing God, and set up his throne in heaven. And so in Isaiah 14, where you have Lucifer, that's Halel ben Shakar, you also have a derivative allegory off of that meaning, which is Hellel, which is H-E-L-E-L versus the H-E-Y-L-E-L for Lucifer. And it's an allegory. It doesn't show up anywhere in the Bible as a word, but it's an allegory for the king of Babylon, the king of Babel, which is Nimrod, because he rebuilds or builds Babel after the flood. And so he's the king of Babylon. He's the first post-Diluvian king of Babylon. And he is trying to raise his throne into heaven like Satan did. And we know it's a similar Antichrist archetypical type thing, because in Daniel 8, verses 8 through 10, Antichrist in the end time is going to enter into heaven, probably with similar kind of technology, and throw some of the starry host down to the earth. This is the war in heaven that is talked about in Revelation 12. So that's why I think the story is larger, and I think it's not just allegory. There's some allegory in it, but the story is there for us to understand, because in the time of Babylon, which brings about the Antichrist, this is an end time prophecy with the time of Babylon and Antichrist. And Babel is one of those stories that we need to understand from prehistory to understand prophecy.
That's right, Gary. That's right. And you just connected the dots for us. We just had a comment from Spectre C, and she's pretty much saying, Gary, you are a gift. And that is the fact. And I wonder how he has the energy to do all the shows that he does. And may Yahweh bless them. And Gary does do a lot of shows. Not only that, Gary gets back to you. And like he said earlier, it might take him, a few weeks or what yet, but I know for a fact Gary Wayne gets back to his audience and to his fans, and he does his best to answer the questions. And I want to thank Gary Wayne for coming on this show and answering so many questions for me tonight. We didn't have a lot of questions in the comment box. We had Gabriel just asked a question. Hi, everybody. It's me, Heidi. Heidi, that's her son's name is Gabriel. She's in our Seeking Yahweh's group, Mr. Wayne. And I know Heidi very well. And I know Heidi has a question for Mr. Wayne. So go ahead and ask your question, Heidi, because I know you have a question, and I want to say hi to your son, Gabe, and y'all come up with a question to ask Mr. Wayne. All right, Mr. Wayne, if anybody wants a signed copy of Genesis 6 Conspiracy, you just need to go to Genesis6conspiracy.com, and you can get a signed copy of Gary's book. Also, you can get it on Amazon. And Gary told you the difference between the pricings at the beginning of the show. All right, Mr. Wayne, it's been right at an hour. This is I try to keep you at an hour. Is there anything that you'd like to throw out here?
Well, I do want to thank the comments. I do this it's my honor to answer questions and to do this, and it's my pleasure and my humble honor to be in a position to be able to do this. And it does keep me busy, no doubt about that. But I just think that it's important to get information out there, because everybody's trying to struggle what's going on in the world, and people tend to struggle as well. And I understand it completely, because I was there as well. And the Bible is a very large book, and it's the most supernatural book ever written, and it has so much information in it. And I don't think our churches do a good enough job of teaching prehistory and prophecy today. And that once you start to understand the full context about the good things that our churches teach in the church, but the larger context about some of the things that they don't teach properly, then everything starts to make sense, and the Old Testament comes to life, and prophecy then starts to become understandable.
Yes, Gary. I knew Gabe and Heidi had a question, and their question is, Gary, can you explain King Solomon, the fall, and the influence of the fallen angels and the demons? That's kind of all around there, but.
Well, King Solomon, he was blessed by God with wisdom.
David's
son. So he comes to power after the great warrior king, and he's the one who's permitted to build the temple. As much as David was loyal after God's love and spirit, he wasn't permitted to build the temple, even though he's the one who took Jerusalem. From the Jebusites. That's how long the wars went on. That was I won't go into the details of that. It's getting back into the giant wars, but Solomon starts off with a united kingdom and all the blessings that God can provide him and the peace that David won for him. And the nation becomes extraordinarily wealthy, and Solomon is renowned, and he makes treaties with all of his neighbors, which is fine. He's permitted to do that, but he makes a few mistakes, and he takes wives as part of those treaties. And so he has many, many, many wives and consorts. And the Bible tells us it's the wives who create that portal through their, because they're all polytheists, the ones coming from other nations, not the ones that he would have married from within Israel, but the wives from Moab or the wives from Egypt or where, I mean, because he had so many wives, he probably had wives from each of the major nations around the world because they wanted to have favor with Solomon. But when you're in that type of position and you double that down with the risk factor of now bringing in polytheism from many, many wives that had great influence over Solomon, you create this opportunity for those demons and fallen angels to bring him down, and he falls. I mean, the Bible holds him, in account for his sins. We hope, and we take from his recollection in the Bible that he would have, um, you know, redeemed himself by the time he dies. But there's a period in there where he is definitely on the backslide, and he's creating altars to the various gods of the Baalim, known by different names, in and around Israel. So and then there's outside accounts where he actually commanded the demons to build the temple. I don't know whether he did that or not. We don't get that biblically.
Yeah.
But with his knowledge and with his blessing, he may have been able to command things in a way that initially that other people can't do. And look at how the Holy Spirit was able to provide that type of power for the disciples.
Was he turned into a goat? King Solomon? Yeah.
No, not that I'm aware of.
Solomon.
No. So
he should have been.
But he's still held in very, very high regard. So, yes, he was flawed, but all humans are flawed, and power corrupts absolutely. And even though he was like the priest side of Jesus to the warrior side that David was, neither are at the level of the Word of God. And they're humans. And so we all fall. And, but what Solomon did do, we're very thankful for, because it was very, very important what he did with the empire of building the temple and giving that time of peace. And unfortunately, in the next generation, because of some of the things that he did wrong, it starts the divide that splits the northern kingdom from the southern kingdom, that starts the whole curses of the covenant sort of into play in the various diasporas.
Gary's got one more question. It says, Gary, did the giants come back in those days of Solomon?
Yeah, they were still there. They weren't all wiped out. At least, and if they're not wiped out, if they are wiped out, there are still some very large hybrids that Solomon is fighting against early on and throughout. And there's a couple of kings that are raised up to be punishment for Solomon because of the sins that he makes. And again, I cover this off in the new book, and that's the Hadad dynasties that David was doing war with, both out of Edom and out of Syria. And they are part of the Horim bloodline. And Hadad is one of those patronymic king titles. That's why you have so many Hadads that are talked about, and a Ben Hadad, which just means son of Hadad. So yes, he was, but not to the same sort of degree. And I think mostly hybrids at that point in time.
All right, my friends. Gary Wayne has just written a new book. It follows. Would you say this follows up where your book left off, Gary? Well, how would you come out and describe your new book?
It's an interesting book because it can be read without reading the first book.
All right.
And it's not redundant to what's in the first book. Only parts that are those redundant parts are just connecting in things that need to be to make the new book sort of flow. So what it does is it talks about things in a deeper way and things that aren't in the first book. So the book is called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2, and
right.
it's subtitled How Understanding Prehistory and Giants Helps Define End Time Prophecy. So what I do is I talk about what happened after the flood, most because then as opposed to the first book, I'm talking about a lot of things, before the flood. I'm talking only after the flood and the Rephaim giants and the second creation, and or if some giants survived. I talk about that world order. I talk about all the different tribes and taking them back to the gods that would have created them and maybe a patriarch of those names. I talk about the patriarchless nations. I talk about the angelic hierarchy, and the Baalim and the assembling at Mount Hermon that we talked about. And as I'm going through in the first part of the book, I'm linking that to defining things for end time prophecy. And then I'm going to link into end time prophecy, which rolls some of that important information forward to understand biblical chronology, and some of the interesting parts of Revelation that are become a little bit clearer because we can understand what happened in prehistory. So it also will cover off a couple of parts that I purposely left off in the first book. So I didn't cover the Jesuits as part of the secret society,
All right.
because I just felt it was too much to try and work that in, and there's too much disagreement. But I decided I ought to put them in because they fit with a lot of things that we have to know for end time prophecy. And I also put in where they fit into the hierarchy, and I give the hierarchy and how to understand that hierarchy through the thelemic tree trunk and the branch organizations. And I place those organizations, the main ones of the trunk, in order. And I give you where that word thelemic comes from biblically and why the occult names it the thelemic tree and where they get their power from for that.
And Gary, and if they was go to Genesis6conspiracy.com, would they able to, is there a link to get your new book at that
Not
site, or
yet.
can they go to a different site?
It when Once I get a few things a little bit more clear with the publishers here, I'll go to work on the website. I will be selling the book for signed copies, and again, same links as for the other book off the same website. I'll get
Good.
excerpts of every chapter on that website as well, like I do for the first book. And yeah, so it's going to be marketed from the same website so that it's simpler to do. And I will also be working on putting in a way to pre-order as well. So once we understand what the retail price is, then and I'll need to have put in there a mechanism to pre-order. I don't know what that looks like, but I know I'm getting a lot of requests for pre-orders, and so that's, I think, the best way to handle it is it will be through the website.
All right. I want to thank Spectrum C. I want to thank you for your comments. Spectrum, she's saying, Gary, that she's looking forward to your new book, and she just wanted to know where she could get it at. And she's saying that our show is just very interesting and it hit home for us. And that's what we're here to do. And I thank you, Spectrum C. I want to thank Gabriella. I want to thank Robin Rodriguez, TJ Best, Gabriella, and all those who commented in the comment box. It takes a lot for me to come on there, and I know it takes a lot for you to comment in the comment box. And I just want to thank you for commenting. Gary, we got 37 people tuned in, and but we've run past the hour mark. And so, my friends, if you like what you heard today, go out and get Gary's book. Like, subscribe to this channel. That way, when Gary comes live, you'll know. Hit the bell. That way, you know when we go live. You get a live notification. All of our videos on this channel have Gary Wayne videos. They're all titled, and you can seek out and find out what you're looking for wherever you research. So please go out and check out all the videos that we have on the channel. And Mr. Wayne, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming in tonight. And Mr. Wayne, can I please ask you to close us in prayer?
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Wayne.
Father in heaven, we thank you for providing the opportunity to get together and to commune and to exchange information and just celebrate the reassurance and the fact that you are there for us, and this is all part of your plan. And that I ask that you bless all those who are listening to this broadcast, and to help them with the understanding, and help them to be able to carry the message to others, to continue to spread the word, to get that information out, to understand what's in the Bible, what the opportunities are to come to know you, and how to prepare ourselves for the end times. So we pray these things in the name of our Redeemer, the Word Jesus, who sits at your right hand side and testifies to you for us and for all of the saints. We also pray in the name of the Holy Spirit, in your great and holy name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. All right. My name is Bishop Holsonback. This is my YouTube channel and my Facebook group, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in tonight. May Yahweh bless you. What a wonderful